Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 50. Like Father, Like Son. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed how Kılıç Arslan re-established the Sultanate of Rum, and how the alliance between the Sultanate and the Danişmend Beylik collapsed. How this alliance that had achieved victory over the Crusade of the Faint-Hearted in 1101 met its end, and how war erupted between the Sword Lion and the Silver Prince. And today, we will finish the story of the Sword Lion, as, like his father Suleiman before him, he rides east in an attempt to seize the ultimate prize, the very throne of the Great Seljuk Empire. And as with the father, we will see this attempt of the son end in tragedy. Now, in order to discuss this last chapter of Kılıç Arslan's life, and to understand the relationship between the Sultanate of Rum and the Great Seljuk Empire as a whole, we need to step back a bit and look at what has been happening within the Great Seljuk Empire itself. We have been laser-focused on Anatolia, and so we've sort of missed out on the events in the empire since the death of Tutush and the victory of Berkyaruk in 1095. So this is a good chance to both provide the background and catch us up. So what happened? After Berkyaruk won the civil war against Tutush, he was the supreme leader of the Great Seljuk Empire. Kind of. If you'll recall, Berkyaruk was a teenager when he won the war, so the people who actually won the war were the new breed of powerful emirs that al-Dawla al-Nizamiya had given birth to. And it was they who were really in the driver's seat now. The Sultan, while not quite a figurehead, was not the sort of powerful ruler that Tuhrol or Alparslan or even Melik Shah had been. The sort of decentralizing tendency within the already decentralized empire was then accelerated by a couple key events that occurred in 1097. That is a mere 2 years after the victory of Berkyaruk. Firstly, in the east, Berkyaruk had sent his half-brother Sanjar to Khorasan to put down a revolt that had broken out against the empire. Sanjar thereupon basically took over the rule of the east to himself, becoming the real ruler of Khorasan, Balkh, and eastern Iran. And as we will shortly see, Sanjar will soon become a sultan himself, and thus permanently split the great empire into east-west halves. This was, in a sense, a restoration of the pre-Alparslan equilibrium. Çarı had been the ruler of the east, if you'll recall, and as we covered in our non-narrative episodes, many of the administrators of the empire, such as Nizam-ul-Mulk, were Easterners who had come west. Indeed, the East had retained the structures of government created by the Seljuks far better than the West, and it was really in the East that the central administration of the empire would survive far better. And now, it was basically lost to the nominally Great Seljuk Sultan who ruled from the West. But of course, the other great event of 1097 was the arrival of the Crusaders. The Crusader invasion resulted in the establishment of the states of Outremer in the Middle East, and constant war. And if you'll recall from our episode on the Seljuk collapse, most of the wars of succession following the death of Melik Shah had also taken place in the western half of the empire, in Syria, Iraq, and western Iran. The arrival of the Crusaders, a mere 2 years later, was in a sense a continuation of the war. This, of course, immeasurably strengthened the power and the role of the various emirs, the military men. In the West, they were now the real power of the state. And what existed of the central civil administration of the Great Seljuk Empire in the West, the divans, the civil administrative class, the organized and centralized structures of the Seljuk imperial state, basically collapsed. This is a major reason why it was in the East that the administrative state of the empire continued in a much stronger and more permanent form. Instead, in the West, the military men, the emirs, became the state. On top was the Sultan Berkyaruk, of course. His name remained in the khutbah, and the emirs, on some level, professed loyalty to him. But in a pattern we've seen over and over and over before on this podcast, actual temporal power now fell into the hands of the Turkish soldier caste of warrior emirs and beys. Therefore, for different and actually fundamentally opposite reasons, in both East and West, the power of Berkyaruk was a shadow of what it had been during the days of his predecessors. Al-Dawla al-Nizamiya was definitively and permanently over. 1097 therefore inaugurated a period of extreme destabilization in the empire, at least in its west, because by contrast, the east was actually stabilizing under Sanjar's rule. In many ways, this was a continuation of the upheavals that had begun in 1092, when the civil war began. In those parts of Syria and the Levant not conquered by the Crusaders, the sons of Tutush vied for power. These were Rizvan in Aleppo, who we saw joining Kılıç Arslan's alliance against the Crusaders, and Dukak in Damascus. In northern Iraq, Kerboa, the Atabey of Mosul, was defeated by the Crusaders at Antioch and Edessa, modern-day Urfa in southern Turkey, yet he still ruled a swath of what is today northern Iraq, southern Turkey, and northern Syria until his coming death in 1102. In Mardin, Diyarbakir, and the Jazirat, the descendants of Artuk ruled the expanding and powerful Artukid Beylik. And across Iraq, Syria, and southern Turkey, a host of smaller beys and emirs governed the various towns, cities, fortresses, and citadels. And then this already fractious and destabilized political landscape was completely upended. Because in 1099, Berkyaruk's half-brother Muhammad Tapar revolted in Azerbaijan. Muhammad Tapar was assisted in this by his capable Grand Vizier, Mu'ayyid al-Mulk, a son of none other than the great Nizam-ul-Mulk himself. Unsurprisingly, Mu'ayyid al-Mulk had been a key supporter of Berkyaruk in the wars with Terken Khatun and Tutush. Remember that the old partisans of Nizam-ul-Mulk gravitated towards Berkyaruk, as it was Berkyaruk who Nizam-ul-Mulk had supported as Melik Shah's successor. Now, Mu'ayyid al-Mulk abandoned Berkyaruk and threw his support behind a different son of the late Melik Shah. He was followed in this by many of the old partisans and allies of Nizam-ul-Mulk and the Nizamiya Mamelukes, who happened to be powerful in the Iranian heartland of the Great Seljuk Empire. Muhammad Tapar's forces soon marched into northern Iran, taking Rey. Esfahan itself was soon lost to Berkyaruk, who decamped to Baghdad. The loss of Iran was crippling to Berkyaruk, who then faced even worse news. Predictably, while in Iran, Muhammad Tapar reached out for aid from his cousin Sanjar in the east. Sanjar, of course, leapt at the chance, as he, naturally, detested Berkyaruk and wanted his own rule of the East to be confirmed. Thus strengthened with Eastern reinforcements, Muhammad Tapar was soon invading Iraq. A vicious war then unfolded in Iraq between Muhammad Tapar and Berkyaruk. Baghdad itself changed hands 5 times. This completely destabilized the western half of the empire, and Iraq basically became a war zone. Whatever authority Berkyaruk had held in the west was broken, and the central power of the empire in these western lands slipped even further. Basically, the Seljuk state stopped existing across most of Iraq, Syria, and even parts of Iran. And critically for our story, this resulted in chaos on the borderlands of Anatolia, critical to the Anatolian Turkish Beys. In particular, a conflict between the descendants of Artuk, that is the Artukid Beylik, and a very talented Turkish slave soldier turned general named Jokermish. First, Diyarbakir fell to the second Artukid Bey, Sökmen ibn Artuk, as did Samosata and Saruj. The Artukids were aided in this by the Turkish beys and tribes who had lost territory in Cilicia and the Levant to the Crusaders, and were now streaming east, looking for new homes. But the Artukids had a great enemy in the region, the Beylik in Mosul, led by Kerboa and Jokermish. Now, Jokermish was a slave soldier who had previously fought under Berkyaruk, before rising to power himself under Kerboa, the Atabey of Mosul, who we last saw failing to defeat the Crusaders outside of Antioch. After Kerboa returned from the west, he remained the Atabey of Mosul, but he kind of began to retire a little bit and delegated power to his capable general, Jokermish. And Jokermish and Kerboa quickly came into conflict with the Artukids. War broke out between the two rival beyliks, and even Sökmen's nephew Yakuti was killed in the struggle. But the real turning point was in 1102, when Kerboa died. Jokermish succeeded him as the Atabey of Mosul, and Sökmen took the great city of Hasankeyf in southeastern Turkey. A sort of decentralized Artukid beylik led by Sökmen thus came into existence in Hasankeyf, Mardin, and Harput, while Jokermish expanded his power from Mosul. And Jokermish would go on to adopt the young Imad ad-Din al-Zang, who will go on to be the next great Atabey of Mosul, and inflict crushing defeats on both Muslims and Christians alike. Thus, Jokermish, a Turkish slave Mameluke, in some sense stands as the proper founder of what would come to be the fearsome Zengid Emirate. And it was these two rival beyliks, the Artukids and Jokermish's beylik, who now held the only real passages into Anatolia controlled by the Muslims. This was the chaotic Seljuk political world that the reinvigorated Kılıç Arslan would shortly crash into. Because in a stroke of great luck, it would turn out that as the Middle East fell further into chaos, Kılıç Arslan's position kept strengthening. And it would be this strengthening of the sword lion that would ultimately lead him, like his father, to take a colossal gamble in the East. One that would ultimately come to doom him. So why did Kılıç Arslan's position strengthen? What caused him to take this great gamble? Well, there were a lot of things, but really, it was all sort of fortuitous. Things completely outside of his control kept breaking his way. This wasn't so much a master stroke by the sword lion, it was really that his rivals and enemies kept destroying each other or otherwise just dropping dead, leaving him in Anatolia as one of the key Seljuk political potentates in the entirety of the western half of the empire. And this is all the more remarkable given that he was on the very edge of destruction like 5 years ago. Quite the turnaround in position, and one that kind of just fell into his lap. So to start with, while Kılıç Arslan and Gümüştegin had been incredibly successful in crushing the Crusade of the Faint-Hearted in 1101, other crusaders had actually been racking up victories elsewhere, and this was happening just as civil war and instability in Iraq, Syria, and Iran ripped apart the Seljuk state. In 1103, Matthew of Edessa reports that Baldwin, the Count of Edessa, inflicted a serious defeat on yet another Turkish bey in the region, the Artukid Bey Uluk Salar in Mardin. Matthew of Edessa writes, he, Baldwin, killed many of them and captured their emir, who was named Uluk Salar, as well as his women and children who were taken into captivity. Baldwin led to the city of Edessa countless herds of sheep, thousands of horses, cattle, and camels. This entire mass was brought to the city of Edessa. Thus, as Kılıç Arslan was defeating Gümüştegin in Maraş, the Crusaders had taken out a potential rival of his in southern Anatolia. And then, yet further events transpired that improved Kılıç Arslan's position in the east. In 1104, Berkeruk was forced to sue for peace, and the Sultanate in the west basically split. Muhammad Tapar was recognized as the nominal ruler of most of Syria and Iraq, except for Baghdad, while Berkeruk was to be the ruler of Iran and Baghdad. However, this was merely a fig leaf. In reality, Berkeruk had effectively lost the Sultanate in all but name. Indeed, archaeologists have not found a single coin bearing Berkeruk's name minted after 1104. Truly a sign of how far he had fallen. And though Muhammad Tapar was now the top Seljuk potentate in the west, the powerful emirs of these lands weren't really his reliable vassals. He would have to negotiate and fight and bully his way into being more than ruler in name only. Meanwhile, in early 1104, Baldwin attempted to follow up on his victory in Mardin by besieging the city of Haran. This ancient city lies in the far south of modern-day Turkey, south of Urfa, that is Edessa, and near the Syrian border. But Baldwin was unable to take the city, and thus called upon his allies Bohemund and Tancred, who, remember, were allies of Gümüştegin and opposed to the alliance of Kılıç Arslan and Alexios Komnenos. As this great Norman army besieged the city, Jokermish appeared from the east. A great battle commenced on May 7th, 1104, and the crusading army was utterly destroyed. Ibn al-Qalanisi relates exultantly, "This was a great and unexampled victory for the Muslims. It discouraged the Franks, diminished their numbers, and broke their power of offense, while the hearts of the Muslims were strengthened, and their zeal for the victory of the faith and the war against the heretics was whetted and sharpened." Bohemund and Tancred managed to escape, but Baldwin himself was captured and taken off to Damascus. This was the first great victory of the Muslims over the Crusaders in the Middle East itself, and not in Anatolia. Bohemund's dream of creating a great kingdom in the Middle East was essentially broken, and in late 1104 he went back to Italy to raise further troops, leaving Antioch in Tancred's hands. But Bohemund's goal for his new army was not to invade Mosul. Rather, he was determined to defeat his real enemy, his hated enemy, Emperor Alexios Komnenos in Constantinople. This meant that the Christian enemies of the alliance between Kılıç Arslan and Alexios Komnenos suffered a grievous defeat. And a grievous defeat that neither Konya nor Constantinople had to spend a drop of blood or a single gold coin to attain. So yet another great and entirely fortuitous boon to the Sword Lion. And then even better news came to Kılıç Arslan. As we discussed last time, in 1104, Gümüştegin Gazi, the Silver Prince, died in Sivas. Following his death, the great Danişmand Beylik turned inwards and became divided among two of his 12 sons. In Sivas, Emir Gazi would take the heartlands of the Beylik, the lands of northern and central Anatolia where the Beylik had been born. There, Emir Gazi would lead the Danişmand Beylik to the zenith of its power. Meanwhile, his far less successful brother, Sungur, took the newly conquered Malatya, and in doing so, basically became target number one for Kılıç Arslan. So now the Danişmand Beylik was divided and weakened, further strengthening Kılıç Arslan's position. And then death followed upon death, because 1104 just happened to be the year that many of the key Western Seljuk potentates died. Dukak ibn Tutush, the Emir of Damascus, Sökmen ibn Artuk, the lead Artukid Bey, and most importantly of all, the great Seljuk Sultan Berkyaruk himself. The son of the great Melik Shah, Berkyaruk had overseen the collapse of the great empire, and by the time of his death, he was largely powerless, dominated by his emirs, and facing a great revolt by the talented Muhammad Tapar. Following the death of Berkyaruk, Muhammad Tapar became the sole sultan for like 5 minutes. Because when news of the death of Berkyaruk made its way east, Sanjar claimed the sultanate for himself in Khorasan. This was the nail in the coffin for a united Seljuk Empire. From here on, the fates of East and West completely diverged. The East under Sanjar would enter into a new golden age, and Sanjar would go down in history as one of the greatest Seljuk rulers, and the last to truly rule in the East. The picture in the West was far less rosy. The deaths of all of these Seljuk potentates further destabilized the existing power structures in the western half of the empire, creating space for newcomers, provided that they had the force and the will to seize it. Sökmen's brother Ilghazi in Mardin, Jokermish in Mosul, Rizvan of Aleppo, the great Seljuk Sultan Muhammad Tapar, the Danişmand Bey Emir Gazi in Sivas, and, most importantly for our story, Kılıç Arslan. In a run of impossibly good luck, basically everything had broken his way. He was now one of the top Turkish potentates in the entirety of the western half of the empire, potentially even on par with the nominally great Sultan of the West himself. And like his father before him, as the empire became destabilized and as he grew stronger, Kılıç Arslan began to entertain certain audacious dreams. Maybe, just maybe, the time had finally come for the line of Kutalmış to get its due. Maybe he himself could succeed where even his father had failed, and rise to the truly highest office. To become not just the Sultan of Rum, but the Sultan of the whole empire, or at least its western half. And why not? Berkyaruk was dead, and the entire western half of the empire was in chaos. His cousin, Muhammad Tapar, had claimed the throne in Azerbaijan just 2 years earlier, and was still a weak sultan. Perhaps he could be overthrown. And even if the top job might elude him, from his base in Anatolia, on the fringes of the Muslim world, perhaps he could still become a powerful emir in the center of the empire. And so, like his father before him, his gaze was pulled inexorably eastwards. Thus, with his enemies and adversaries weakened, and the stage cleared of many potential adversaries, beginning in 1105, Kılıç Arslan really began expanding the power and the reach of the Sultanate of Rum, dreaming of getting the top job in the empire for himself. This truly was an astounding comeback. A mere 6 years ago, the Sultanate was on the ropes, and Kılıç Arslan looked totally doomed. He was a sultan without a sultanate, a man leading a broken force of Turkish nomads who had lost his capital and had been humiliated by the infidel invader. Now, the Sultan of Rum was back. And even if the western lands in which his sultanate had been born were lost forever, the Sultanate of Rum was again the supreme Turkish state of Anatolia, and maybe could dream of even becoming the supreme power in the Middle East. Kılıç Arslan appears to have begun with an assault to the southeast. In 1105, he moved swiftly to take the prize that he'd been dreaming of for years. The city that had kept him in the east as the Crusaders had massed their armies and had thus almost destroyed him, Malatya. With Gümüştegin dead and his beylik divided between Emir Gazi and Sungur, Kılıç Arslan spied his chance to wrest the prize from the Danishmends. Though the sources are a bit murky, he appears to have basically bullied Sungur into accepting his sovereignty at some point in 1105. Malatya thus, finally, fell into Kılıç Arslan's hands a decade after he had first laid siege to it. He appears to have marched into the city in 1105, promptly after receiving Sungur's submission. And fortuitously, the situation to the south and east of Malatya was continuing to evolve to the Sword Lion's benefit. Also in 1105, another prince of the House of Seljuk, Rızvan of Aleppo, conveniently lost to Tancred after attempting to seize his late brother Dukak's capital of Damascus. This greatly weakened the other prince of the House of Seljuk in the west, who could dream of opposing Muhammad Tapar. More importantly, in 1106, Jokermish was captured by his subordinate Çavlı Sagave and murdered in Syria near Damascus. Çavlı Bey was a Turkmen adventurer who spied his chance to become the Atabey of Mosul. And Çavlı had a powerful ally in this, none other than the great Seljuk Sultan Muhammad Tapar himself. Indeed, it is likely that Muhammad Tapar had conspired with Çavlı Bey to get rid of Jokermish, seeing the powerful Atabey of Mosul as an obstacle to his consolidation of power. So yet again, disorder in the western lands of the Great Seljuk Empire redounded to the benefit of the Sword Lion. However, we can see here the seeds of the coming disaster. Because though still relatively weak, Muhammad Tapar was determined to rebuild the power of the Great Sultan, and he was furiously working to make alliances with up-and-coming beys like Çavlı. And the Çavlı-Tapar alliance would prove itself to be very, very dangerous. But feeling the wind at his back, in either late 1105 or early 1106, the sources kind of conflict on the year, Kılıç Arslan invaded Syria himself. He made straight for Urfa, that is Edessa, the capital of the Crusader county of Edessa itself. At this point, Edessa was under a sort of joint regency and governorship by Bohemund's allies Tancred and Richard of Salerno. Matthew of Edessa, who was almost certainly actually there as Kılıç Arslan besieged the city, tells us that Kılıç Arslan remained there for some days, fighting many battles. However, Kılıç Arslan soon realized that he was unable to take the city, and thus turned south to another target, Haran. As Ibn al-Athir tells us, the followers of Jokermish stationed in Haran contacted him to surrender to him. He went there and took over the town. The inhabitants were delighted with his coming for the sake of the jihad against the Franks. The reason that Jokermish's men did this is that they likely preferred the sword line to the men who had killed their former lord, namely Çavlı Bey and his ally and patron, the great Sultan of the West, Muhammad Tapar. This seizure of Haran would turn out to be something of an omen for the last fight of Kılıç Arslan's life. A conflict with Çavlı Bey and Muhammad Tapar for the supremacy of Upper Mesopotamia. But though he may have wished to proceed further now, he unfortunately fell ill shortly after taking Haran. Kılıç Arslan therefore returned to Malatya, where he spent the remainder of the year recuperating. His position in the east had been strengthened remarkably. Not only was Malatya in his hands, but so was Haran. Kılıç Arslan was now one of the top military forces in Upper Mesopotamia. But this ultimately, of course, made the other lords of this destabilized region increasingly anxious. These included the Norman Crusaders in Antioch and Edessa, Çavlı in Mosul, and also his erstwhile ally, Rızvan of Aleppo. Soon, Rızvan would enter into an alliance with the Norman Crusaders, and if you'll recall, the Norman Crusaders were opposed to the alliance of Constantinople and Konya. And soon, Çavlı Bey, the Artukid Bey Ilghazi, and the Great Seljuk Sultan Muhammad Tapar would get to talking about what might have to be done with this Sultan of Rum. But unfortunately, after his recovery in late 1106, Kılıç Arslan was not able to focus all of his attentions to the east just yet. Though it was at the center of his thoughts and his plans, he was forced to deal with a matter much closer to home, even as he prepared to march further east. Because in 1107, a message arrived from his new ally, the emperor in Constantinople. Alexios had finally launched his invasion of Norman-held Cilicia. While Bohemond was off in Italy, raising further forces to attack his most hated enemy, the emperor struck. Anna Komnena tells us that Vutumutes, the general we last saw taking Iznik, led a great invasion of Cilicia. And of course, the emperor called on his new ally, Kılıç Arslan, for aid in this great campaign. Kılıç Arslan, still in Malatya and preparing to march east, of course complied. The Normans in Cilicia, Antioch, and Edessa were just as much his enemies as enemies of the emperor. And so, the armies of the Sultanate of Rum and the Roman Empire prepared to march on Cilicia together. Ibn al-Athir tells us, the emperor sent to Prince Kılıç Arslan ibn Suleiman, the ruler of Konya, Aksaray, and other lands, asking for his aid. He provided a detachment of his army. This strengthened the emperor, who marched against Bohemond. Now, Bohemond was of course actually back in Italy at this point, planning to set sail for the Balkans to invade the empire and get his revenge on his hated enemy, the emperor in Constantinople. Instead, Vutumutes faced off against the local Norman forces in Cilicia, and aided by the Turkish army sent by Kılıç Arslan, basically totally crushed them. Cilicia was soon back in Roman hands, even if the matter of Antioch itself would have to be decided later, following the coming war in the Balkans between Alexios Komnenos and Bohemond. Ibn al-Kalanisi reports that after the victory, the Turkish troops were honored by the Romans with ceremonial banquets, robes of honor, and material rewards. However, the Roman reconquest of Cilicia was a side theater for Kılıç Arslan. He was focused back to the east, to the heartlands of the Great Seljuk Empire and his struggles with Çavlı Bey and Muhammad Tapar. Like his father before him, his goal was to use his Anatolian base to increase his standing within the game of constant negotiation that constituted the Seljuk imperial state. But as we will come to see, this decision to aid his ally, the emperor in Constantinople, would come to have devastating consequences for Kılıç Arslan. So with Malatya in hand, and with his influence in Syria on the rise, with his potential rivals weakened, Kılıç Arslan felt that he was well positioned to play his hand. According to Ibn al-Qalanisi, the proximate cause was nothing less than Çavlı Bey's murder of Gökermiş. After capturing and killing Gökermiş, Çavlı Bey had sent the dead Atabey's head to Mosul, where his adopted son, Imad ad-Din al-Zengi, now attempted to secure power. In time, Zengi will go down as one of the most important conquerors in Islamic history, who will found the Zengid Emirate, wrest Edessa from the Crusaders, and lay the ground for Saladin's reconquests. But for now, he's just a young Turkish commander holding the severed head of his dead adopted father. And after sending the severed head, Çavlı, of course, marched on Mosul and with the support of the Great Seljuk Sultan Muhammad Tapar, put it to siege. Besieged in Mosul, and with both Çavlı Bey and Muhammad Tapar against him, Zengi was of course desperate. And naturally, he decided to reach out to the chief opponent of Çavlı and the Great Sultan. Thus, Zengi sent an urgent message off to Malatya, begging Kılıç Arslan for aid and promising to submit to him and turn the great city of Mosul over to the Sultan of Rum. Kılıç Arslan immediately recognized this opportunity for what it was: the chance to become the top Seljuk potentate in the western half of the empire. With Mosul in hand, together with his possessions in Anatolia and northern Syria, he could consolidate control over all of Upper Mesopotamia. And if his ally, Emperor Alexios Komnenos, was successful in defeating the Normans in Cilicia, then perhaps he could succeed in taking Edessa from them in another attempt. From such a position, it was quite conceivable that the new and insecure Western Great Sultan Muhammad Tapar could be defeated, and the line of Kutalmış would finally claim its birthright. And thus, Kılıç Arslan marched out of Malatya and left Anatolia. It turns out, for the last time in his life. Indeed, he may not have even intended to return, hoping instead to seize the ultimate prize for himself. And like his father before him, Kılıç Arslan made what would turn out to be a great gamble. He brought with him to the east one of his sons. A son he likely hoped to turn the rule of the Sultanate over to when the time came. The 11-year-old future Sultan of Rum, Shahan Shah. Now, Shahan Shah is the ancient Persian title meaning the King of Kings in Farsi. This is the fully Farsi version of the name Melik Shah. Indeed, Shahan Shah is often called Melik Shah in the sources, but to avoid confusion with the more famous Melik Shah, I'm going to stick with calling him Shahan Shah. Shahan Shah was reportedly born in 1096, the year that the People's Crusade was destroyed. This would have made him merely 11 years old in 1107. We don't know who his mother was because, as was typical, Kılıç Arslan had a variety of concubines in addition to his wife, who, if you will recall, was the daughter of Çaka Bey. So while it is possible that Shahan Shah was the grandson of Çaka, we can't know that. And now, the young Shahan Shah was fatefully marching east with his father Kılıç Arslan, just as his father Kılıç Arslan had done with his grandfather Süleyman decades earlier. And that voyage, if you will recall, had ended in the death of the father and the imprisonment of the sun. Foreshadowing alert. As he marched towards Mosul, Kılıç Arslan received reports that Çavlı had detached a portion of the besieging army and ordered it sent west, determined to stop the Sultan of Rum before he could reach Mosul and relieve the city. The vanguards of the two armies met at Nusaybin, on the borders of Turkey and Syria, near the Artukid city of Mardin. There, the Anatolian armies of the Sultan of Rum routed the forces sent by Çavlı Bey. Kılıç Arslan thereupon entered Nusaybin and prepared to march on to Mosul. But in an omen of things to come, Ibn al-Qalanisi reports that his army was not large because he had with him only a portion of his askar, the remaining being in Anatolia to assist the king of Constantinople against the Franks. And it would turn out that aiding his ally, the Roman Emperor Alexios Komnenos, would have dire consequences for the Sultan of Rum. Like his father before him, he was marching east with too few troops. Recognizing this, Kılıç Arslan summoned as many troops as he could from Anatolia to join him in Nusaybin. But with a large portion of his armies aiding the Byzantines in Cilicia, this was going to be a tall order. Meanwhile, hearing of the defeat of his forces at Nusaybin, Çavlı Bey decided that he had to break off the siege of Mosul. But he had not given up the hope of defeating the Sword Lion. Instead, Çavlı decided that he had to regroup and reinforce his position in Syria. With the support of his allies and the Great Seljuk Sultan, he could then attack the Sultan of Rum again. According to Ibn al-Qalanisi, he made this plan having learned that Kılıç Arslan had sent to summon the remainder of his askar from Anatolia and had with him only a small force. And so, Çavlı Bey retreated from Mosul to the west, back to Syria. He stopped at the small mountains of Sinjar, working desperately to gather allies and reinforcements. And it turned out that there were many men wary of the rise of the Sultan of Rum. As we have discussed, the political situation in the west of the empire, and in particular Upper Mesopotamia, was completely destabilized, and many emirs could see that the rise of Kılıç Arslan and the victory of the Sultanate of Rum, the line of Kutalmış, was a distinct possibility. Thus, not only did Muhammad Tapar provide further troops, but Ilgazi, the Artukid Atabey of Mardin, joined Çavlı. If Kılıç Arslan took Mosul along with Nusaybin, the Artukid territories would be basically sandwiched between the lands controlled by the Sultanate of Rum. This could easily be a death sentence for the Artukid Beylik. Also sending troops was Ruzvan of Aleppo. Ruzvan had of course joined with Kılıç Arslan to defeat the Crusader invasion in 1101, but after making his new alliance with the Normans after his defeat, he too saw that the victory of Kılıç Arslan could very well spell the end for his emirate in Aleppo. And so, a strong coalition to oppose the Sword Lion came into being and began to rapidly assemble its forces. As Çavlı Bey assembled this force to oppose the Sultan of Rum, Kılıç Arslan marched on to Mosul. According to Ibn al-Athir, before departing Nusaybin, he received a delegation of the notables of Mosul, asking him to take certain oaths to rule justly before he took the city. Kılıç Arslan took these oaths and asked for reciprocal oaths of loyalty, which was agreed to. These Iraqi notables then joined Kılıç Arslan's army as the Sultan of Rum marched on to Mosul. They arrived at the city on March 22, 1107. As Kılıç Arslan approached the city, Zengi and his men came out of the city to meet and swear allegiance to the Sword Lion. This Kılıç Arslan accepted and rewarded them with robes of honor. He then entered the city. Once in Mosul, Kılıç Arslan took the final, momentous step. As Ibn al-Athir reports, Kılıç Arslan took his seat on the throne and dropped Sultan Muhammad Tapar's name from the khutbah and added his own after the caliphs. This was, of course, the great act of rebellion and the key marker of sovereignty in the Muslim world. Kılıç Arslan thus denied the right of Muhammad Tapar to hold the Sultanate and proclaimed himself as not just the Sultan of Rum, but the Sultan of the Great Seljuk Empire. Over 40 years after the death of Kutalmış at the hands of Alp Arslan, the time had finally come for the line of Kutalmış to claim its birthright. Kılıç Arslan, knowing the power of the coalition opposing him and the fury of Muhammad Tapar when he heard that his name had been dropped from the khutbah, immediately took action to create a rival coalition. Though he insisted on putting his own men in control of the citadel of Mosul itself, he quickly confirmed the Iraqi beys in their positions and promised them more. In particular, he confirmed in his position the Emir of Diyarbakir, thus denying the right of the Artukids, and confirming that Ilghazi was correct in opposing the Sultan of Rum. Kılıç Arslan then began to prepare to take the fight to Çavlı Bey and Muhammad Tapar, to enforce his new claim to the Sultanate of the Great Seljuk Empire. Meanwhile, as summer set in, Çavlı left Sinjar and marched further to the west. His goal was to take one of the most important citadels of Syria, Al-Rabah. Al-Rabah was originally built during the late Abbasid period and was key to controlling Syria. The citadel sits on a hill on the west bank of the Euphrates, in the middle of the otherwise flat expanse of the central Syrian desert. This position allowed it to dominate a great length of the upper Euphrates River, as well as the river link along the Euphrates from the rich lands of northern and western Syria through the relatively barren Syrian and Iraqi deserts towards Baghdad. It was therefore fought over by Seljuk potentates of the west after the collapse of al-Dawla al-Nizamiya. It fell, in turn, to Tutush, Kerboa, a Mameluke bey named Kaymaz, Dukak, and then yet another minor bey named Hassan. Now, in spring 1107, Çavlı Bey was marching from Sinjar to take this key citadel. If he succeeded, it would weaken Kılıç Arslan's tenuous foothold in northern Syria, currently centered around Haran, which lies about 240 kilometers to the north of Al-Rabah. The arrival of Çavlı and his army prompted the local governor of the region to write to Kılıç Arslan in Mosul, pleading for aid. Like the garrison in Haran, this local governor appears to have been a former follower of Jokermiş, whose loyalties to his successor Çavlı were lukewarm to say the least. A man not entirely thrilled with the way that Çavlı had captured and killed his former master. Believing that he had to stop Çavlı Bey from taking Al-Rabah, in late May 1107, Kılıç Arslan mustered his forces and prepared to march out to defeat Çavlı Bey, even though his armies were still relatively thin due to a large contingent of men campaigning in Cilicia alongside the Byzantines. These men had not been able to ride east, and so Kılıç Arslan's army was going to be outnumbered. However, by the time Kılıç Arslan was on the road to Al-Rabah, he received word that the citadel had fallen on May 23, 1107. Kılıç Arslan therefore stopped his advance near the Khabur River, a tributary of the Euphrates in what is now northeastern Syria. Kılıç Arslan had likely been hoping to catch Çavla in the siege, when he would be able to rely on the troops inside the citadel to help him defeat his enemy, or at least drive them from the walls. Outnumbered as he was far less sure about an open field battle. But for his part, Çavla Bey was determined to bring the sword lion to battle, likely for basically the same reason. And with him, now, was Kılıç Arslan's erstwhile ally, and the current ally of the Normans in Edessa and Antioch, Rızvan of Aleppo. This combined army rushed northeast from Al-Rabah and up the Khabur. The field battle that Kılıç Arslan had hoped to avoid was now inevitable. The two armies met on Thursday, the 23rd of June, 1107, in the baking heat of the Syrian desert near the river Khabur. Ibn al-Qalanisi says, "It was then midsummer. The heat was intense, and the ground scorching, and most horses on both sides perished." And like his father Suleiman before him, in his last battle, though outnumbered, Kılıç Arslan decided to attack first. There are many things that can be said against the sword lion, but no one can call him a coward. In the baking heat of the Syrian desert, Kılıç Arslan ordered his army to charge, and the Anatolian Turks, the emirs of northern Iraq and Diyarbakir, and the Turkmen Mamelukes of Mosul rushed forward. According to both Ibn al-Qalanisi and Ibn al-Athir, this great charge of Kılıç Arslan was initially successful. Ibn al-Athir reports that Kılıç Arslan advanced with a vanguard, cutting through his enemy's ranks and making for Çavla himself. He severed the standard-bearer's hand and himself reached Çavla, to whom he gave a sword blow, which cut his brigandine, but without penetrating his body. But Kılıç Arslan was unable to strike again, and Çavla's bodyguard rushed forward and pushed his charge back. Now the battle began to turn. Ibn al-Qalanisi tells us that Çavla and Rızvan launched a great countercharge, which split the Anatolian army away from its Iraqi allies. These Iraqi forces under the emir of Diyarbakir were split off and began to flee. Outnumbered, the Anatolian army of the Sultanate of Rum began to break and rout. The armies of Çavla Bey and Rızvan of Aleppo overwhelmed the sword lion, who no doubt in that moment cursed himself for sending a large portion of his armies to aid the emperor. Ibn al-Athir tells us, when Kılıç Arslan saw that his army was defeated, he understood that if taken, he would be treated as an implacable enemy, especially as he had challenged the Sultan in his own lands and for the title of Sultan. He therefore urged his mount into the river Khabur and shot some arrows to defend himself from Çavla's men. But as Kılıç Arslan desperately rode his horse into the river in his attempt to escape, he came into unexpectedly deep water. His horse faltered, and both the mount and the rider were swept away down the river and drowned. Kılıç Arslan's body washed up down the river several days later. Ibn al-Athir says that he was buried in a small village on the river Khabur, but other sources say that he was taken north and buried in the vicinity of Diyarbakir. In 2021, Turkish archaeologists claim to have found his grave in the village of Silvan, near Diyarbakir, though this is disputed. Following Kılıç Arslan's death, Çavlı marched on Mosul. The city had no way of resisting his advance and submitted without resistance after receiving a guarantee of safety. There was in fact only one man in Mosul whose safety was not guaranteed: Şahan Shah. After the great defeat at the river Khabur, Şahan Shah had fled back to Mosul. Now he fell into the hands of Çavlı Bey. Ibn al-Kalanisi reports, the son of Kılıç Arslan had taken refuge in the city, and Çavlı seized him and conveyed him to Sultan Muhammad. As had occurred a generation earlier, the defeat of the father was followed by the imprisonment of the son. Şahan Shah was sent off to be imprisoned in Esfahan, the very same city in which his father, Kılıç Arslan, had been imprisoned after his own father's defeat. Çavlı restored the name of the Sultan Muhammad Tapar to the khutbah, permanently ending any attempt by the sultans of Rum in Anatolia to claim the highest office in the sprawling imperium ruled by the House of Seljuk. Thus passed Kılıç Arslan I, the Sword Lion, the second Sultan of Rum. What can we say about him? Kılıç Arslan was one of the most consequential Turkish leaders of all time. Indeed, we've spent more time with him than any prior Turkish leader, a total of about 11 episodes. The decade of his reign saw some of the most momentous events of Turkish history: the invasion of the Crusaders, the great battles at Iznik, Dorlaim, and Merzifon, the rebirth of the Sultanate of Rum in central Anatolia, and its failed attempt to take over the Great Seljuk Empire itself. He personally commanded troops at some of the greatest defeats and victories in Turkish history. And his life itself was kind of crazy. He stood at his father Süleyman's side as the Sultanate of Rum was established in Iznik on the doorstep of Constantinople, and as his father captured Antioch. After Süleyman's defeat and death, he was imprisoned in Esfahan in Iran for nearly a decade before escaping and riding west to seize the throne. He oversaw the expansion of the Sultanate of Rum across Anatolia, as well as its near destruction at the hands of the Crusaders. Then he led a guerrilla war of resistance, recasting himself as the leader of a holy alliance to defeat the infidel, ultimately leading to the great victories at Merzifon and Ereğli. And in the last chapter of his life, he attempted to seize the greatest prize of all, the throne of the Great Seljuk Empire. But was he a good sultan? That is far more ambiguous. He certainly was successful in gaining power quickly and in running the Sultanate before the arrival of the Crusaders. And after the great disaster of the Crusader invasion, he survived against the odds. And not just survived, but indeed rebuilt the state after it was basically destroyed. He skillfully put himself at the head of the Turkish War of Resistance and led the alliance to fantastic victories at Merzifon and Ereğli. And his campaigns in the east thereafter were similarly quite successful, at least for a time. However, we cannot overlook his mistakes, of which there were many. For one thing, he should not have sent so many troops to aid the emperor when he was marching east himself. This was a key factor in his failure and his own death. Maybe he should have also been content with ruling Anatolia, instead of taking such a colossal gamble to become the great sultan of the West. Losing that gamble turned out to be catastrophic, not just for him, but for his state. The coming weakness and vassalage of the Sultanate of Rum after his death is at least in part on his shoulders. But more than any of that, and above all, his hubris led him to make what is arguably the most catastrophic mistake of a political leader in all of Turkish history. He allowed the Crusaders to march basically unopposed to the walls of his capital, which he then lost. And then, after scrambling to pull together an army, he lost a second time at Dorylaeum. This led to the total collapse of Turkish rule in Western Anatolia for centuries, and almost led to the total destruction of his own state. As I said before, totally and completely unforgivable. A complete and utter dereliction of duty that, in my opinion, utterly tarnishes and stains his entire reign. Indeed, many of his greatest victories and successes were basically heroic rescue operations to salvage something from his own catastrophic errors. Yes, it's very impressive he saved the Sultanate, but what he saved the Sultanate from were the consequences of his own actions. And that is what makes Kılıç Arslan so fascinating. In some ways, he was a great sultan. In some ways, he was a catastrophic failure. But above all, the most important thing is that he was consequential. He fundamentally changed the course of Turkish history, and indeed world history, forever. Following the death of the Sword Lion, the Sultanate of Rum would fall into chaos and would come to be eclipsed by the other beyliks of Anatolia. But this would not last forever. Ultimately, the Sultanate would rise again and reclaim leadership of Turkish Anatolia. Like his father before him, Kılıç Arslan had laid or relaid the foundations of his sultanate well, and the state had been firmly re-established. And, like Kılıç Arslan before him, Şahanshah would not stay in captivity in Iran. So next time, we will see yet another prince return to Anatolia from the east to claim his birthright. And we will also introduce the man who will eventually come to build on the foundations laid by his grandfather Suleiman and his father Kılıç Arslan. A man who will really bring the Sultanate of Rum into its maturity. One of the greatest leaders in the history of the Sultanate, who will lead the Turks to great victories and once again turn the Sultanate of Rum into the greatest state in Turkish Anatolia. A young man who has, up till now, been in the shadows. The future Sultan of Rum, Masud I.